Welcome everyone. This is Pruzbol, a Talmud Shiur with Rabbanit Leah Sarna, one of our many classes in the Fall Zman 2021 class focusing on Shemitah year. This is class number 4. We are happy to have you here, and if you are interested in learning more about Shemitah, we will be having many classes, some in progress, such as with Rabbinit Gila Rosen starting tomorrow at 1 p.m. and very much picking up on today's topic on Wednesday, Shemitah, Radical Perspectives on Society, Land, and the Individual. And starting right before Thanksgiving, we will be having a new class in the series on topic of a Sabbath of the Land for You. Sabbath of the Land for You, Shemitah, ethics, and Jewish philosophy. So keep an ear out. There will be plenty of Shemitah learning going on, as is fitting with the year. All right. And people are strongly encouraged to accept the invitation to panelists. It's always nice to see people's faces. You are invited to keep your camera on. All I ask is that you mute yourself if you're not currently talking so that we can avoid any feedback. And with that, Rabbanit Sarna, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, welcome back. So this is our 4th class on Pruzbol, and we are picking up where we left off last time. For the sake of completeness, we're going to do all the Gemara, but the topic that we're going to dive into is in Kotvin Pruzbol Ella al ha-karka. So Pruzbol is only written for a debt secured by land. So Kayla, can you throw the source sheet into the chat? Because we're actually going to introduce this topic a little bit by looking at the Mishnah in Shvi. And we'll look at 2 commentaries on the Mishnah. We'll look at the Bartenura and the Rosh Mishans. And then we'll go back into the Gemara. We'll pick up where we left off last time. And when we get up to where the Gemara quotes the Mishnah and Shvi, we'll then look at Rashi and Tosfot and their debates on this Mishnah and Shvi. We'll see where the Gemara takes the Mishnah and Shvi and expands on it pretty dramatically. And then we'll look at the end, as promised last week, we'll look at something that feels like it's related. So again, our topic today is Pruzbol is only written for a debt secured by land. So if you have a debt that isn't secured by land, as meaning I lent Kayla $1 million and Kayla does not have even one tiny piece of property to her name. So she's holding on to my $1 million, but without any collateral in the form of land. So that's a type of loan that maybe I can't write a Pruzbol on, that actually I just need to relieve that loan potentially. So that's the question. That's the topic we're looking at today. And that seems kind of similar to this thing that some people do when they're selling chametz, that in addition to selling the chametz, they sell the property that the chametz is in. So they'll sell the shelf that the chametz is on, and the shelf, because it's connected to the house, which is connected to the ground, is considered property, or it's unmovable property, I think is the way to say it. It is property, it's unmovable property, the shelf. And sometimes you'll even see, if you look closely at the sale agreement, which a lot of people don't do, right? Because your average person just writes just sends a form back to the rabbi saying, here's where I keep my liquor, here's where I keep my dry goods, here's where I keep my wherever. And you never actually see the bill of sale that and witness. Actually, the sale itself is amazing. When I worked at a synagogue in Chicago, we always used to do the sale and the unsale publicly. We would invite congregants to come and watch, because it's very, very interesting, and we would teach about why we do it the way we do it. And one of the pieces that not everyone does is this kinyan agav karka, that the sale happens in addition to or alongside with the sale of a piece of land or unmovable property. So we're going to talk at the end about whether this idea that in Kotvin Pruzbol Ella al Hakarka, whether or not that's similar to a Kinyan Agav Karka. And then obviously with Michirat Chametz, there's this whole additional complexity of like, how does a sale to a Gentile work? And we're not going to get into that at all, but just this idea of Kinyan Agav Karka in general. Okay, so we're going to start out with the Mishnayot and Shvi'it. So if you're, again, in the handout, which Kayla has put into the chat a number of times, thank you, Kayla, we are in source number 1. So the Mishnah says, in Kotvin Pruzbol Ella Karka, Pruzbol is only written when there is land involved in the debt. If the debtor has no land, so I lent Kayla $1 million, but she doesn't have any land to her name, then I should be mezakehu b'toch sadehu kolshu. I should say, okay, Kayla, like this tiny piece of my backyard, I'm gifting to you, and now your debt has some land attached to it, and therefore I can write a Pruzbol for this debt. But also the Mishnah says, but also the type of land that Kayla needs to own in this situation is expansive. So let's say Kayla has a piece of land in the city, and she actually already used it as it's already memushkenet, it's already pledged maybe to someone else. Actually, Kayla has multiple debts. She borrowed $1 million from me, but she also borrowed $1 million from Gabriel. When she borrowed $1 million from Gabriel, yeah, sorry, Kayla, it's a rough day for you. When she borrowed $1 million from Gabriel, Kayla said, and as collateral, here's my field in the city. And Gabriel said, okay, my Pruzbol can still be written on account of the fact that Kayla has this. Kayla still has some relationship to that piece of property, even though it's also collateral for her loan to Gabriel, which he will be collecting soon. Well, you better, unless you wrote a Pruzbol, your time to collect is ticking down, because before Rosh Hashanah, it's either a Pruzbol or you lost it. So, okay. So Rabbi Chutzpit Omer Kotvin leish al nechse ishto liyatomim al nechse apotropim. So you can even maybe write a Pruzbol if Kayla has a spouse who has some property, or if, God forbid, she's an orphan, then if her apotropos, if her guardian has some property, then maybe like that could be effective as property on which I could write a Pruzbol. Like if Kayla, if someone in a family relationship, let's say with Kayla, owns property, then that might be sufficient for me to write a Pruzbol also. And then there's like a fun next thing that doesn't actually come up in our Gemara, but it's in the Mishnah, and I just thought it was so interesting. So the question is, what's the status of a beehive? We actually had at Drusha, you can find it in the audio library. I have a friend who's a colleague who's a beekeeper. Her name is Amalia Haas, Rabbanit Amalia Haas. We had her last year during Winter's Man when we were talking about food, and she shared Torah about bees, and it was like totally out of this world. So if we were like having this Shiur on Pruzbol forever, I totally would have brought Rabbanit Amalia today, and we would have discussed together whether we think about this debate between Rabbi Elazar and Chachamim about the beehive. But here we go. Okay, so kaver dvorim, a beehive. Rabbi Elazar omer harehi kakarka. Rabbi Elazar says a beehive is like land. Kotvin aleha Pruzbol. So, and what are the implications of it being like land? 1, if Kayla owns a beehive, then I can write a Pruzbol for the debt that Kayla owes me. 2, ina mekabelet tuma bimkoma, until it's detached, it is not susceptible to impurity, because anything that kind of like grows naturally from the ground and is still attached to the ground is not susceptible to impurity. That's one of the reasons why like you can't use schach that's like still growing out of the ground. Like you can't, like if you like build your sukkah on and it has like grapevines growing over the top or something, like if the grapevines are still attached to, I mean, whatever, that there's a lot of complicated things about that situation, but the grapevines are still attached to the ground, definitely not kosher schach. Okay, so that's it's not susceptible to tuma, and haru dami menu b'Shabbat chayav. And if you take honey from it on Shabbat, you're chayav, you violated potentially an Isser Torah, and that Isser Torah, say the commentaries on this Mishnah, which I didn't bring you, is tolish. You picked. It says if the beehive is like a tree and the honey is the tree's fruit, and you did tolish. You picked the honey off the beehive. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, but Chachamim say Eina kakarka. Chachamim no, beehives aren't like property. They're not like land. You cannot write a Pruzbol on them. In Kutbin alei Pruzbol, mekabelet tuma b'mkoma, and they are susceptible to uncleanness even while they're in their place. V'harodami menu b'Shabbat patur. And if you take honey from it on Shabbos, it's not a good thing to do, but it's not an Isser Torah. Gabriel asks, is this a natural beehive that's attached to, for example, a tree, or a man-made beehive that's a big box on the ground? I assume we're talking about a natural beehive. Yeah, I think that's at least the easiest read here, because anything that's man-made for sure is, or is almost certainly going to not have these rules of like tuma, and the idea that you'd be like picking it as like slisha doesn't make any sense. So I think we're talking about a natural beehive, like bees made this beehive. Good question. Okay. So when we're, just to like give us like a taste of where we're going, we're going to see a three-way machloket about what the reason is behind in Kutbin Pruzbol el ala karka. Why does Kayla need to own property in order for me to write a Pruzbol? It's a very strange idea, actually. So we're going to see a three-way machloket, but here's the first one. We're going to see the Bartanura, and then I debated where I was going to teach the Rashi Shantz, but we're going to look at the Bartanura in source 2, and then we're going to flip to source, I think it's like source 9. Yeah, we're going to flip to source 9, which is the Rashi Shantz, who says a very similar idea to the Bartanura. So we're just going to like fully go in on this idea now, and then we'll carry on from there. Okay, so here's the Bartanura. He says, Ela ala karkan, says that you can't write a Pruzbol, ela im kain yesh lo karka lelove. You can't write a Pruzbol unless the borrower, Kayla, has real estate. Sha'az, and this is the part I'm curious to know how you guys read this. So sha'az chashuv hachov kegavui biyad beitin, because then it's considered as if it's collected by the hand of the court. V'lo karinan be'lo yigosh, and that we don't call it a violation of lo yigosh, which is what, if you can look in source 2.5, we saw this in the first class. That's what the Torah says is like what you're not allowed to do. Why you have to remit loans during the Shemitah year is every creditor should remit the due that he claims from his fellow. Lo yigos re'ehu ve'et achiv ki karash mitala Hashem. Sorry for the shimot there. He shall not dun his fellow or his kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of Hashem. But you are allowed to keep loans vis-a-vis foreigners, Gentiles. You can hold on to loans from the foreigner, but you have to remit whatever is due from your kinsman. So the Bartanura puts forward a kind of difficult to understand argument, and I'd love for people to unmute and say how they understand it. He says, just now we've like reviewed what Torah violation we're trying to circumvent through Pruzbol. How does the Kayla owning land help me circumvent the Torah violation of lo yigos by a Pruzbol? So he says, as chashuv hachov kegabui biyad beitin. The liability is considered as collected in the hand of the Jewish court, and somehow Kayla owning land makes that possible. So does anyone have an idea or an explanation about why Kayla's land ownership somehow makes it better? Yeah, Dira, please.
Maybe like a straw man argument, you know, where you're kind of like putting up this idea, oh, if she wanted to, she could, I don't know, whatever, do something with her land. So instead we're kind of saying Bezdin is gonna like I don't know, maybe some type of like black magic. I don't know. I'm not
Oh,
sure.
I kind of wait. Maybe where you were going at the beginning was sort of like, if Kayla has this property, then she could have repaid the loan. Is that where you're going with it?
I don't know, but sure.
Because that's kind of interesting. Meaning everything you were saying was interesting, but that's like, I think one understanding of it is like, well, if Kayla owns property, then clearly like she has this loan because it's good for her to have a loan in some way, and therefore my keeping the loan is not oppressive because Kayla chose it, right? Because if she wanted to unchoose it, she would repay me because she has property. So maybe that's one way. Yeah, Kayla, were you gonna say something?
No, I just want to point out in the comments from Noah that in this case my land would be collateral.
Yeah. Noah, do you want to say more, either by typing or by speaking, about what you mean by that? No. Okay. Yeah, so definitely Kayla's land is collateral. And I think there's a few ways you could understand that. You could say Kayla's land is collateral, and therefore, and that makes it like more of like a normal type of loan, maybe. And we'll see that's actually like almost like a different opinion. Like we'll come back to that when we see Rashi's opinion. But maybe here, like maybe if that's going with where I was going with Adira, that the collateral is like, yeah, like once there's collateral in a loan, the loan doesn't need to exist because like I could just collect the collateral and the loan would be erased. So maybe where Noah's going is like the fact that there is collateral means that like the loan isn't so serious, like the loan is optional or something like that, and could be repaid at any moment. And therefore it's not as much of a violation of lo yigos. Does anyone else have like a read on Hashuv Hachov Kegabui Biyad Beitin? Because that's the part that I feel like we haven't fully like wrapped our hands around yet. I feel like one of the piece of it that we have wrapped. Oh yeah, Adira, go ahead.
I don't know. This might also be a stab in the dark, but like, I guess maybe they're saying that it's as if it is collected. So therefore, it's like lo yigos, and then afterwards it'll be like reinstated and he'll have to pay it, or she'll have to pay it.
Oh, okay. So that's a great read, Adira. I think there's a lot really good in what you're saying. So the fact that there is collateral means that, and that maybe like the Beitin has access to that collateral, right? Because we see all over the Gemara Beitin like repossesses people's property, people's land. So maybe the fact that there's collateral means like what Adira was suggesting is like it's as if the Beitin like collected it, and therefore like the loan was nullified, but then they kind of like almost like reinstated the loan like after they had collected it. And so now the loan is owed vis-a-vis the Beitin, but not owed vis-a-vis me, the original lender. And so I'm not violating lo yigos, but the loan still stands. And you can only do that once there's like some thing to like transition ownership like with. But Gabriel says, why does it have to be specifically land? So with that question, let's turn to the Rosh Mishans, because he kind of does get to that. So this is source 9. Sorry again that it's out of order. Okay, so he says he's the Rosh Mishans is commenting on the Mishnah here. He's a commentator on the Mishnah here. So he says, Elim kinyesh lo karka luluve. So unless the borrower has land, the az chashuv hachov kigaboy biad bitin. So he says the exact same thing with the Bartanura. It's the debt is seen as if it's been collected by the Beitin. The lo karina le lo yigos, and we don't call it do not done. Ukamalva sheyesh aleha mash. Going exactly as Noah said, it's like the lender has collateral. It's like the lender has collateral. Okay, period. V'hai adifa karka mi-metaltalin, and the fact that land is preferred over metaltalin are like movables, right? So like the whole world is divided into like movable objects, which are metaltalin, and unmovable objects, which are essentially land. That's basically if you're looking for ways to divide up everything, That's one of them. Okay, so the fact that we prefer immovable objects to movable objects, lav mishum dekalin, it's not because it's not because the metalta, movable objects, can like be used up. They are kalin. And this is why I had it at the end, because this is going to make more sense once we see it in the Gemara. But the hare eitz nakuv hamunach al gabe yetedot deyachol. So the like most extreme example given in the Gemara of like what could constitute land on which someone could base a Pruzbol is a pot with a hole at the bottom that's not even sitting on land; it's sitting on pegs. But you have like a pot with a hole and on stilts basically, and that's like the minimum amount of property that Kayla needs to own in order for me to write a Pruzbol. So he says, so the Rosh Hashanah says, hold on, but that could disappear easily. Like that could get used up totally. Tracy could walk by, trip on I'm making you clumsy, sorry. Tracy could walk by, she could trip on the planter, and all of a sudden it's gone. But says the Rosh Hashanah, but Umar Bahasholeach on our daf, exactly what we're gonna see. The Kotrin a Pruzbol, but I can write a Pruzbol if Kayla has a pot with a hole. Ella kachudin de karka chashiva kegavui tfei. Rather, this is just the principle of the matter that land is more considered as if it's already been collected. Like this, like almost like I think Adira's language for it was like black magic. This like magical thing that we're imagining happening of like the Gittin like absorbing it, transferring ownership to the Gittin, but then spitting back out an owed loan it just says the Rosh Hashanah, it just happens better when it's done with property. But I think it really like Adira's read of this as like, woo, is definitely quite a strong one, and I think he really gives evidence to you. So he tries to answer. He asks Gabriel's spot on question, but only then like digs the proverbial hole a little bit deeper of like this being a kind of a difficult or problematic read. So, okay, let's go back to the Gemara now. Unless anyone has questions, I can't promise you any answers to your questions. Okay, Tracy, just to clarify, we're talking about debt that was originally set up with land as collateral, or a debt that was not set up with collateral initially, but when the Pruzbol was written with the Gittin, they added the idea of collateral to the deal. Great question, Tracy. So at what point does this land come into the equation? And the Gemara is that we're going to see the answer in the Gemara. So let's hold tight on that question, but it's a really important one, right? Because if we're saying that the collateral is essentially the understanding that we've discussed so far that I like the most is that if Kayla owns property, then it's not so oppressive when I keep the loan because Kayla could have paid me back. And so she wanted the loan to stand, and like that's it. Like that's that was a condition, and so it's not a violation of Legos, and that's not where the Bartanura or the Rosh Hashanah took it. And that's not exactly the read. That's like maybe the read that Rashi puts forward, and we'll see in the Rashi. But that's good. But that's going to really turn on Tracy's question of like, well, in order to effectuate a Pruzbol, is it that like the only loans that can stand are loans that I've made to people who like don't actually need them, and every other type of loan I actually have to give back? Or is it like some technical thing that just accomplishes Adira's black magic? Because if it's some like technical thing that accomplishes Adira's black magic, then I can just do it at the time of the Pruzbol. It could be this like atzitz nakuv, this like this pot with a hole in it, and like that's it, good enough. But if it's meant to tell me something concrete about the type of the loan and the type of the borrower, then that should happen like originally, and not at the point at which I'm writing a Pruzbol, unless you want to say, oh, Leah, Kayla borrowed your money. She started a business. She's not ready to give you your money back yet, but her business is doing real well. And so even though when she borrowed the money from you, she didn't have any property and she couldn't do anything with it, But now she's really prospering. And in fact, the reason why she hasn't paid back the loan is because in the meanwhile, she reinvested her profits in yachts or whatever. No, yachts are a bad example. She reinvested her profits in land. And so now she has land and she can add the land back into like the renegotiated pre-Pruzbol deal. And so really maybe all that we care about is actually like, if I made my original loan to Kayla at the end of the last, like right at the beginning of the Shemitah cycle, let's say. So like maybe this is the time to say, okay, Kayla, like what's happening? Pay me back. Or and Kayla's gonna say, well, I don't want to pay you back. But I've invested in land, and so now I can, and I've done really well, and now we can write a Pruzbol, and that gives me some opportunity to not pay you back yet. And so there's something that like makes a lot of sense about Kayla's land ownership as like a standard by which like that's the type of person, whether at the beginning of the loan or towards the end of the loan, that's the type of person who maybe can and should have the agency to say, I want to keep my loan, as opposed to someone who doesn't have land. But that's not what we're seeing in the Bartner or the Rosh Hashanah. Like the Bartner and the Rosh Hashanah are really saying like, it's just this thing that makes it work. And for them, I think definitely, Tracy, it would make definitely like the minute before the Pruzbol is written, just some property needs to change hands, right? And that's and we saw that already in the Mishnah in Lo, right? If Kayla doesn't have any property, I can give her like this big of a piece of land from my backyard, and all of a sudden I can write my Pruzbol. Noah says this whole pot is a wrench in my gears. The other sources had better fix it. I don't know if they're going to fix it, but it's in the Gemara. So let's see it in there. So let's open the Gemara. We're going to just, for the sake of feeling like we've completed something by the end of this, we'll just read from where we were last time. There's going to be like two little mini topics before we get back to in Kodvin Pruzbol Ella al Hakarka. So just forgive that, but they're really good little mini topics. So I hope you'll enjoy the little journey. So we said, at the beginning of class number 2, we talked about like, what is this word Pruzbol? And I brought you some like Greek, but here's the Gemara's understanding of it. So the Gemara asks, my Pruzbol, if you're in the Gemara on the page, we're at the very, very bottom of Lamed Vav Amud Bet. So my Pruzbol, what is Pruzbol? Amar of Chizda, Pros Bule Uvute. So it's I don't know, it's these couple of words. So it's an ordinance, a pros of bule and bute. Now he or the Gemara going to explain what these two words are. So bule, elo ashirim, these are wealthy people. Oh, sorry, we got a question from Judith. Okay, Judith, we're going to come back to your question in a second. Okay, so bule, elo ashirim, these are the wealthy people. And now we're going to do a tricky thing where we're going to quote a verse and then we're going to quote like a traditional, like a memra, an Amoraic statement that interprets this verse. So the verse is Vishivarti Gaon Uschem. So that's Vayikra 26. I will break the pride of your power from the curses in Vayikra. And Tanya Rav Yosef, and it's taught in the name of Rav Yosef, Elu bulaot shebeYehuda. So Rav Yosef says these are the bulaot of Yehuda, and that means that Rav Yosef is interpreting Geon Uschem as bulaot, and from there the Gemara concludes that bulaot are ashirim, that bulaot are wealthy people. So we did a kind of a confusing thing here, but we're not going to spend too much time on like kind of the strangeness of the Gemara's interpretive play here. And then bute, elu ha'aniyim. So bute, these are the poor people. Dichtiv ha'avit ta'avitenu, and ta'avitenu bute. I think that's the play here. So you should surely lend to him. Ha'avit ta'avitenu. And who's the person who needs the loan? Those are the poor people. Rava has a different story about what this term means. So Amar le Rava le lo azah. Rava says to someone who speaks a non Hebrew language. If you look at Rashi, she'ino medaber belashon ivri hu le'uzam ve'ota shesha'al rava himanu zot haya medaber belashon Pruzbol virish lo shebil shono paruz porsa takana. So he says that Rashi says a lo'azah is someone who doesn't understand Hebrew. That's a lo'azah. And the one who Rava asked from him is someone who speaks the language of Pruzbol. and then Rashi means it's a language in which they have like it's a little hard to translate this Rashi, but it's like in his language they have words that sound like this more or less. Okay. So Rava asks this lo'azah, what is Pruzbol? Amar le porsa de milta. So he says to him, it is an institution of a matter, a porsa de milta. Okay, so either it's an ordinance or it's some kind of agreement between the rich and the poor. That's what Pruzbol is it's actually the first read, even though like what's happening kind of like the interpretive like jumps that the Gemara is going through are a little bit tricky, but the idea of Pruzbol meaning an agreement between the rich and the poor is actually a really nice idea in my opinion. And that as opposed to it being, because like the original story or like the main story we have about it is like Hillel invented Pruzbol because people weren't keeping the Torah. And here we have kind of maybe a different understanding of Pruzbol, which is Pruzbol is the poor people saw that the rich people weren't keeping the Torah, and they kind of like came together to make an ordinance that would resolve it and that would help them take care of themselves. So that's kind of nice actually. Okay, next side topic before we get to ours. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Yetomim in Trichim Pruzbol. Orphans do not require Pruzbol. L'chein Tani Rami Bar Chama Yetomim in Trichim Pruzbol. And similarly, we have a teaching in the name of Rami Bar Chama that orphans don't need Pruzbol. The Rabban Gamliel Ubitino Avihem Shel Yetomim, because Rabban Gamliel and his Beitin are the fathers of orphans, meaning that like the Beitin has this kind of like fatherly guardian relationship vis-a-vis orphans in the first place. So there's no point when orphans, let's say, inherit, like let's say I'm God forbid an orphan and my father had lent Kayla $1,000 or it's $1 million, right? My father had lent Kayla $1 million. The Beitin like already is involved in my financial well-being, and therefore I don't need a Pruzbol because like the Beitin is already playing like a guardianship role in my finances. So there's no point in me like sending something over to the Beitin. Okay, now we're back to our topic. That was just like a sidebar by way of completion. So now we're gonna say it's not hatam, it's taught over there in the Mishnah, in our Mishnah, in Shavit, in Kotvin Pruzbol Ella al hakarka. We do not write a Pruzbol except for on land, except for on property. Okay, now I'm going to go back to Judith's question. Judith said, Gabriel. So this is only when the orphan is the lender and not the lendee. That's interesting.
And there's also a question from Judith from earlier.
Yeah, I'll get back to that in 1 second.
That was a while ago. We've kind of left the issue.
No, we're coming back to it. That's why I waited on it, because we're about to get back to it. No, that's an interesting question, Gabriel. I bet it works in both ways. Yeah, I think it probably works in both ways. I have to look it up and get back to you, Lamasa. Okay. So now we're back talking about collateral, and now we're gonna look again at Judith's question. Collateral usually has to equal the value of the loan. Good. So if we're headed right to this topic right now, collateral usually has to equal the value of the loan. So if the borrower defaults, the collateral is taken to make up for the unrepaid loan, right? It's either equal or more, right? So let's say Kayla borrowed $1 million from me, and as collateral, if she was going to give me, let's say, a watch, it would need to be a $1 million watch or a $2 million watch, and then either she would repay me and I would give her watch back, or she wouldn't, and I would like pawn the watch, take $1 million and give her the other $1 million or something in that direction. So this is therefore different than collateral. Okay, so good, perfect question. Rashi right now is going to address your question. Yeah, okay. So we saw the Bartanura and the Rosh Mishatz who say that when we say we only write a Pruzbol on Karga, this is Adira, I'm just gonna keep going back to like your language. That just like makes it easier. The existence of property makes it easier for Gittin to kind of like take ownership over the loan, and it does it through this kind of like black magic, like boom, it just like facilitates that like transition of property from one person to another, and it facilitates it better than metaltalin, than movable property could possibly facilitate it. Okay, so now we're going to look at the Rashi on Ella al-Hakarka. Okay, Im yesh karka lelove. So the Pruzbol can only be written on written like alongside property if the borrower has property. The lo tiknu, because the rabbis didn't establish the Hillel didn't establish Pruzbol, ela bizman shehachov kashar rov shtarot. So Pruzbol is established for times when the debt is like other shtar is a document, but like here, let's say like a document that's documenting a debt. And debts are usually collected from land. And that's like the most common way of collecting it. If there's a debt that I'm holding, like I'm holding a shtar chov, I'm holding a document that says Kayla owes Leah $1 million. And Kayla doesn't pay up, I would go to the Beit Din and say Kayla hasn't paid up. There would be some kind of procedure, and then the Beit Din and I would go and collect from Kayla's property. That's like the normal way to do that. And that's cases like that are discussed in a bunch of places in the Gemara. And the rabbis don't typically make ordinances about unusual circumstances. So an unusual circumstance would be someone giving out $1 million loan without any kind of collateral and without Kayla owning anything that I could go and collect my loan from. That would be an unusual circumstance. And the rabbis don't make ordinances around unusual circumstances. And here's to your point, Judith. And even though the property is not worth the entire debt, so Kayla owns a property that, let's say, is worth $100, or even less, right? If I gave her like this much dirt in my backyard, that's not worth $100. Okay, because it says further on, any property of any size. Afilu malay machat. Afilu malay machat gova malay kardom kema asad de katina de abai. Even if it's the size of a needle, I can collect as if it's the size of an X, as it was the case in the katina of abai. So meaning, what Rashi is arguing, and we're going to see the case of the Katina de Avaya in a second. We're going to turn to Ketuvot, which is the next source on the sheets. It's source 5, not to be confused with source 8, source 5. It is source 5. The Katina de Avaya, just to like preface it, because it's a little bit confusing, is a case where a loan was owed, the collateral is insufficient to the amount owed, and yet the lender was able to collect the full amount. Sounds like magic. Very weird. Judith's face, exactly right. All right, so turn now to source number 5. We're in 209D1B. You can also pull it off the shelf, whatever you want. Okay, it's a very weird case, but once you read it, you're like, huh, I don't know. Yeah, maybe land is magical. And this idea that land is magical is actually very important. So we saw already land is magical. It enables the Beit Din to like do this weird thing. Here's going to be land is magical. because it can be worth like an infinite amount. And we're going to see that again in a different context in the Tosfot. So this idea that land is magical is very much like playing a strong role here. Okay, so hahu gavra dahavu maski by mea zuzai. So you have a certain man who had a creditor. So in this case, Kayla is the man. Kayla, you're gonna die, just so you know. Trigger warning. Right, Kayla's the guy. He owes a creditor 100 zuz. Okay, and Kayla dies. Kayla had left Shavik Katina Da'ara to have a Shavia Chamishim Zuzeh. So Kayla had left to her children a plot of land worth half the amount of the loan, right? So the loan was 100 and she has a plot of land worth 50. So I come along, I'm the person who had lent her the first 100, the Katarifle, and I claim Kayla's 50 zuz plot of land. Azul Yatme, but Kayla's children, they're like nostalgic. Oh, it's the plot of land that we grew up on. They come to me and they buy back the plot of land. Yavule Chamishim Zuzeh. They buy back the plot of land from me for 50 zuz. So again, Kayla owes me 100. She dies leaving a 50 zuz plot of land. I collect the land that's worth 50 zuz. Her children come and buy it off of me. So now the children still owe me 50, but they've paid up 50 and now they're sitting on their plot of land again. Hadar Katarifla. And then I go back and I take the plot of land again. Okay, so just to recap, I collected the plot of land. It was half of what I was owed. The children bought it off of me. So now I'm still sitting on 50 zuz, which is half of what I was owed. And so then I go and take it from them a second time. And now I have everything I was owed. But the children go before Abaye because they're very unhappy that I just claimed their land a second time. But Abaye says to them, Amar lahen mitzvah al hayatomim lifroa chov avihem. He says to Kayla's orphans, it's a mitzvah for you to repay the debt of Kayla. And hani kamai mitzvah viditu. So initially you performed a mitzvah, you partially settled the debt of your father. Hashda kitarif bedin katarif. And now that I have reclaimed the land, I did that appropriately. I appropriately reclaimed the land because again, it's a mitzvah on them to settle the debt, and the debt was for 100 zuz. And so far I only have half of it. Velo amran Velo amran delo amrule hani chamishim zuze dmei ara katina. And we don't see that in this case, they said to him, this 50 is the our payment for the land. But if they but if they had said to him, these 50 dinar are a payment for the small tract of land, then they would have totally removed my claim from the land. So it's a little nuts, right? So basically Abaye is, Noah's making a nice point, like so nice to give them the opportunity to do a mitzvah. But basically, if they could have used words to fully, when they purchased the land off of me, they could have used words to completely sever my my relationship to the land, like my debt collecting relationship to the land. They did not use those words at that time, and therefore I was able to go collect the property a second time. That's how Abaye ends up with his ruling. But the point of it here, and the reason why Rashi's bringing it, is that here's a piece of land. I'm owed 100 zuz. Here's a piece of land earned worth 50, and at the end of the day, I repaid my 100 zuz from this piece of land worth 50. So this amazing thing where you have a collateral that's not worth the full thing, and yet it still ends up being worth it. And that's like a specific magic that property has to it. That the worth of property is very like, almost like squishy. It can like go up and down in confusing and amazing ways. Okay, so that's Rashi. Now we're gonna look at Tosfot. Tosfot say, okay, so we're in Tosfot Ella al Hakarka. So we're in source 7 if you're on the source sheets, and we're at the first Tosfot on the page if you're in the Gemara. The Tosfot say El ala karka, and the first thing they do is they quote Rashi. So they say Mishum demilta deshchichu shemilave lami sheyesh lo karka. It's the most common thing is to lend to someone who has property, and because the property isn't gonna, you can't like use up the property, right? So like if and property in that situation is better than a watch, because let's say Kayla says, oh, this watch is my collateral, but the watch could like stop working, it could degrade, like something could happen to it. The market of like watches could change, it could lose all its value, like a million things could happen to the watch. But land is ideally going to be there. I mean, we did kind of see we saw last time, I think, like if I'm trying to remember. Okay, maybe I'm not sure whether we saw it, but we do have situations where like, oh, the land gets like destroyed. We didn't see this together. Sorry. We have the Gemara and Bava Kama talks about cases where like land gets absorbed by a river or something. Like land can kind of disappear altogether, but much less likely for the land to just like get used up than movables. So we're back to our pot with a hole in it, which we'll see in the Gemara in a second. His understanding of the pot with a hole, how that can function as karka, is low plug Rabbanan b'makarke. He says there's a low plug when it comes to property. So this is called karka, this is called immovable property, this is called immovable property. The same rule applies to all of it. We're not going to get too granular, we're not going to get too detailed. So what's like the minimum amount of thing that we would call property? That's our atzitz nakuv on stilts. Like that's our pot with a hole in it on stilts. That's like the most minimal version of property. And the reason why, we're going to see it in the Gemara in a second, the reason why the Gemara brings it in is actually to say, yes, like we don't make distinctions. It's a low plug. We don't make distinctions when it comes to property, to karka in this case. Okay. So v'hada kadvinan a karka kolshu pirish mekunshus mishum derui legabopo kol hachov kamaseg de katina davai. And so the fact that the Gemara says, yes, any amount of land works for a Pruzbol. And he says, Rashi says, right, Pirish B'Kuntras, it's explained in B'Kuntras' Rashi, that based on the story of the Katina and Abaye's ruling, you can actually collect more money than you might think from even a small amount of land. Okay, so that's all Tosfot, but and Tosfot seems to here really be going in the direction of Rashi. But now Tosfot's going to bring Rabbeinu Shmuel, and Rabbeinu Shmuel is going to bring a third understanding of why Pruzbol needs to be written when there is land in the equation. Rabbeinu Shmuel pirish mishum de karka kolshu shava kol hachov de'ein ona ala karko. So Rabbeinu Shmuel is going to say, oh, actually, there's magic to land. This is our third understanding of why land is so magical. Because any amount of land can be worth the entirety of the debt. The ein ona ala karko. So in order to understand what ein ona ala karko means, we have to like take a step back and understand what ona'ah means in general. So ona'ah, we often translate as like oppression, but when it comes to money, ona'ah is overselling or underpaying. So the Gemara in Bava Batra goes to like extreme lengths to describe how you would tell whether you're overselling or underpaying for something, and whether and how how you determine market rate, and a lot of Parakas Zahav is about this, and it's like very, very interesting ona'ah, and also then you have questions about like, well, isn't it a market, and like how does capitalism fit into all of this and whatever. Like it seems it's a very complicated, ona'ah is a very complicated idea, and how it fits into like our current understanding of like how value works, because it actually seems to think like everything just has like a certain set inherent correct value, but that only applies to movable objects. That only applies to metaltalin. But if we're gonna say there's no ona'ah for karka, what that means is that we don't know, or there's no appropriate price for land. Land, you can't like oversell or underprice or underpay for land. Land is like infinitely kind of like squishy in that direction. And so therefore you could, like, you might say, oh, this land is only worth 50 zoos, but like that doesn't stop me from trying to sell it for 100 to fully repay my debt, for example. And so maybe I'm going to reclaim your tiny little karka kolshehu, but then I'm going to figure out some reason, maybe there's gold underneath your tiny little plot of land. And now all of a sudden I could sell the plot of land for $1 gazillion to someone who wants to open a gold mine. And all of a sudden it becomes a lot more valuable. And that's allowed because Ino Na'ala Karkaot. Ino Na'ala Karkaot is really a debated idea though. And that's the next line in the Tosfot. The kasher, and we're not going to actually look into this tomorrow. I brought it for you. It's source number 8. But source number 8. We're not going to look at it, but just because I'm keeping an eye on the clock and we have a lot left to do. But the Gemara in Ketubot talks about how if the Gittin undersell or undervalues a piece of property by more than half, the mekach is there's bitul mekach, like the transaction is void. So on the one hand, we want to say, oh yeah, not like we have this idea that floats around, particularly in Rishonim, like it's not as present an idea in the Gemara, that there's no ona by karka. You can value it really high, you can value it really low. It doesn't matter. There's no like fixed price idea for land. And on the other hand, Tosfot questioned this opinion of Rabbeinu Shmuel and his whole idea that Eino Na'ala Karko in general, because we do have this idea that there can be an inappropriate sale with property if it's undervalued by more than half, by half or more, rather specifically. Okay, so but just to recap our 3 positions. So we have the Bartanura who says the Gittin, like the land is just what enables the Gittin to take ownership of the debt. The Rashi who says this is just how normal debts work. And into the Rashi, I want to read this idea of like that it's a normal kind of debt because it's a debt that's collectible. And in a debt that's collectible, Kayla has a certain amount of agency, and that means that I'm not violating the spirit of the psukim that are all about oppression. That's my like addition to the Rashi, but I do kind of think it's there. And then we have this third opinion by Rabbeinu Shmuel who says the reason why it's land and it's any amount of land is that land is like this very, like the valuation of land is so stretchy that even a tiny amount of land, all of a sudden might enable me to repay, might enable the loan to be repaid in a different way. Okay, so those are our 3 different understandings of like how and why in Kudin Pruzbol Ella Ala. Okay, so now in the next 8 minutes, I want to finish the Gemara. So we're going to run through the Gemara here, and then we're gonna, and then what I want to do is in the last like 2 minutes just to talk about Mechirat Chametz really quickly. Okay, so we just saw the very we'll go back to Tznan Hatam in the Gemara. So Tznan Hatam in Kufin Pruzbol Ela Karka. And we're still quoting the right, so we don't write a Pruzbol except for if there's lands involved. In Einlo, and we saw this in the Mishnah. If Kayla doesn't have land, I should allocate like a tiny piece of my field to Kayla, then I can write a Pruzbol. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to ask, Vikama kol shehu. When the Mishnah says kol shehu, any amount, what is like the minimum? What does that mean? Like, what's the minimum? Amar Rabbi Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav. Rabbi Chia bar Ashi says in the name of Rav, afilu kelach shall kruv, even land that could grow a stalk of cabbage is sufficient. Amar Rav Yehuda, afilu hishilu makom letanur ulechirayim kofim alav pruzbol. Even if I lent Kayla a place sufficient for an oven and a stove, that would be sufficient. And is that is that really the standard? V'hatani Hillel, but doesn't Hillel teach in kufin Pruzbol ela al atzitz nakuv bilvad, nakuv in she'ino nakuv lo? So doesn't Hillel teach you write a Pruzbol only on the basis of Kayla owning at least a perforated pot? And this demonstrates, and what this shows is that if it's not perforated, then it needs to be perforated. And if it's not perforated, then it doesn't work. So there's a lot of different ways to read this as like a question onto the tanur v'kirayim, onto the oven and stove. Like maybe the oven and stove don't have a hole, and the hole is what connects like the thing to the ground and what makes it like a piece of the ground. So maybe that's kind of tricky. It's a little bit confusing how to read this. Right, so it seems like the question is, right, it needs to have a hole. So if your oven and stove have a hole, then great, it works. But if they don't have a hole, then that's not good enough. Right? Wait, well, why? Because the space that the oven and stove are on is good enough. And they say no, it's still the pot with a hole in it, lo tzricha, still needed to be taught the manach asichi, because actually it's still like the most extreme case if the pot is up on stilts, if it was put up on pegs, I guess is maybe the better translation for siche. And so that still makes it like the most minimal possible example, where it's not even that the hole is what like connects it to the ground, which is maybe what we were originally thinking, but actually no, it's this like tiny little pot that's like hung up on stilts, and it still counts as property somehow, and that's like a whole crazy thing. Okay, and now we're gonna just have some stories about rabbis writing Pruzbols, and these stories actually, I mean, we're only getting to them now, obviously, but these were mentioned in sources that we saw earlier, where it's sort of like, oh, well, like when we were talking about who has the authority to write a Pruzbol, so one opinion was like, oh, well, maybe like only, and like when was Pruzbol done? Like, did Hillel only establish Pruzbol for his generation or for later generations? And now we're going to see like the latest generation mentioned in the Gemara. We're going to see Rav Ashi and his Beitin and his students and his friends writing Pruzbol. So that gives evidence for like Pruzbol can be written by people like this. Pruzbol was written even in the generations long after Hillel, all sorts of stuff. This comes up in those conversations, but obviously we hadn't gotten into it yet. So I'll just throw that into your pocket for when you review for next time. Okay. So Rav Ashi mi-penei gidma d'dikla. So Rav Ashi would, when he would lend out money, and when he wanted to write a Pruzbol, he would write it on a gidma d'dikla, a stump of a palm tree, the katav ale Pruzbol, and then he would write a Pruzbol on it. So the question of like, well, at what point does the property need to belong to the person actually seems like here when Rav Ashi is making the loan, he's transferring the stump of the palm tree, but he does that when he makes the loan. He already has in mind, I'm gonna want to write a Pruzbol, and therefore he transfers at that point the stump of the palm tree. And Rabbanit to be Rav Ashi Masri Malayhu Hadadeh. So this is also really interesting. It's a little bit irrelevant, but because we're in Rav Ashi land, it says the students of the Beit Midrash of Rav Ashi would like just send word to each other. Rashi understands this to mean like they would just like let each other know, oh, you're my Gittin, you're my Pruzbol, and actually they wouldn't even write out a formal Pruzbol. It would just be like, I'm transferring my debts to you guys, bye. Rabbi Yonatan Masar Amelia Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Rabbi Yonatan gave word to Rabbi Chia bar Abba, and then he said to him, Tzricha midei acharina. Do I need something else in addition to just like telling you that you're my Pruzbol Beitin? Amar le lo tzricha. And he says to him, no, like that's good enough. You don't need anything else. Your statement suffices. Okay, and now we're going back to our topic. Now we like took a little bit of a left turn from it. So Rabbanan, so we had a baraita in lo karka, ula arev yesh lo karka. So if Kayla doesn't have any property, but she has a guarantor. So she said to Adira, can you insure my loan for me? So if a dira has property, then kotvein alav Pruzbol. Then we can write a Pruzbol for the loan. Lo la'ariv ein lahem karka. So if Kayla and Adira, neither of them have property, u'lechayav lo yesh lo karka, but someone owes Adira money and that person has land. Well, very complicated. Kotvein alav Pruzbol, mizer Rabbanit. Then that person's land is also good enough to write a Pruzbol for this whole situation. The Tanya, as we learn in a breiter, Rabbinat omer minayin lenosha bechaviro maneh bechaviro bechaviro minayin shemotzi mizeh v'notnin lezeh Talmud omar v'natan l'asher hashalo. So basically, Rabbinat says that I didn't quite stick to my timetable here. Rabbinat says that if let's say there's like Adira owes Kayla money and Kayla owes me money, so we can just collect from Adira and pay me. Like we can skip Kayla altogether in that situation. And so too, like when you have a whole string of people, one person owes to the next, or one person's the guarantor from the next, or whatever. Like if somebody owes property, then that's good enough to kind of resolve the whole string of people for a Pruzbol. Okay. So again, we saw 3 different positions about like what the land here is doing. I think all of them reflect this certain like reverence that we have for land, that it can like make things happen and be worth things that maybe like don't make sense otherwise. And just the way it works, I actually brought you like a whole paragraph by Rabbi Jachter in source number 12 about Mechirat Chametz and how Kinyan Agav works. And the one thing I'll say is that like the reason why I brought it and the reason why I think it's so interesting is it's another situation where like the immovable property, or like the way that the Mishnah describes it as nechasim sheish lahem achrayut, can like effectuate something that doesn't seem like it has anything to do with it. Meaning I'm not trying to sell my shelf, I'm trying to sell my chametz. And yet the shelf actually makes the sale of the chametz possible. So like the shelf makes this other transaction possible. And I think it just adds to this like mystique of land, that we have much clearer understanding about how land transfers ownership and how land transfers ownership between Jews and Gentiles even. And so maybe that can pave the way for transitions of ownership for metaltalin too. And I think that other than it being kind of obviously thematically linked, I think it even ties into this idea of land as like something that that can just like make things happen. Like land can just like make things work. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking now. You can look at those sources in your own time. There were some discussions in the chat that I did not keep up with. Property is okay. If they come back a second time, yeah, calling it a mitzvah, you change the collateral into a magical item. Otherwise, in this case, it would really fulfill its role and get its own value back. Okay, I think there's an interesting connection back to the discussion about Rabbanit versus Doraita Shmita, because if there's still Yovel, property is actually no longer stable as a collateral. Fascinating. Yeah. Well, and maybe what that does is to say Yovel like undermines this whole thing. Gabriel, that's a very good read. I really like that a lot. Right. So like, and what it would mean is that in a Shemitah year that is attached to a Yovel year, and there's like a whole debate about how that works. Like, is it like Shemitah net, like Shemitah would be year 49 and then Yovel is 50, or like whatever, how it works. But there's always gonna be a Shemitah that's either like adjacent to or on the Yovel year. So on that year you can't do a Pruzbol. Like there's no Pruzbol by Yovel. So it could work even in that way. Because the requirement of karka would then be what would undermine Pruzbol in that situation. Or what you're suggesting, which is in some ways like even stronger, is to say in the original read, like before we got to Rava, in the original read, it was like Shemitah, right? In Abaye, it was Abaye's original read, right? Hang on, let me make sure I got this right. Yeah, right. Abaye says Shvit Bizman is that. Where we don't have, one of the opinions of Shvi Bizman Azaz, like we don't have Yovel, and therefore Shvi is only Derabanan, and therefore we can like do things like there, and that's part of what enables Pruzbol. So you're saying, this is very good. You're saying, oh, we were like tilting towards Rava, that it's all about Hefker, Beitz, and Hefker. And now you're saying, no, the fact that Pruzbol is dependent on land ownership being consistent is back to being great evidence for Abaye, that this only works when there's no Yovel, because otherwise, like the whole thing is undermined. That's very good. That's a really good point. And so there's no way for Pruzbol to be established between two people, neither of whom own land. Good. So I was going to show you guys the Shulchan Aruch on this. Maybe I'll do that real quick. Okay. Here's just the debate about, so we saw that debate even within the Tosfot about whether there's ona'ah with karka. So the Shulchan Aruch says these are things that don't have ona'ah at all, and one of them is karka. But the Ramah says, so that's Rabbeinu Shmuel's opinion, and the Ramah says no, dafka ad palga, avayutermi palga. So right, if the land is undervalued by more than half, then that undoes the sale. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch really goes through like a bazillion possible cases. Many of them obviously are going to seem familiar. One case that we didn't see is, so let's say we saw a case related to this, but we didn't exactly see it. So let's say there's 5 people who all owe me, like let's say, I think in this case you could say, I don't own land, Kayla doesn't own land, but like Judith, Adira, and Gabriel also all owe me money. And it happens to be that Gabriel has land. So Gabriel's land could be actually enough for all of them, which is really funky, right? So that's what Shulchan Aruch here says, and he obviously has a million sources for it. Chamisha shalavu me'achad, dailo b'pruzbol achad, v'imlavu b'shtar achad, afilu ein karka el echad mihem, kovim pruzbol al kulam. So if I made, if there's one document that enacts a loan between me and all 4 of you, or all 5 of you in this case, like only one of you needs to own property for that, as an example. But yeah, so really like we're talking about like teeny tiny amounts of land, but I think, yeah, like at the end of the day, if nobody in the equation owns any land, then yeah, I think you're not writing a Pruzbol. But I do think that for like, they can't even imagine that situation. I think that's also a piece of it. Because also remember, land is not like, I'm a huge property owner. Land is like, even Kayla's apartment would be land, right? So you have to like tweak it's unmovable things. Okay, we are over time, and we will pick up next week.
All right, and thank you for everyone who's joining us today for Pruzbol, a Talmud Shiur. If you are interested in learning more about Shemitah-related topics, we have plenty of classes in Fall Zman, especially starting up either right before or right after Thanksgiving. You can find out more at risha.org/classes. And everyone, have a good night.